That's correct.
Closer to the end of 2014.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. Okay. Is there a possibility that after that meeting with Mr. Essa, you might have sent emails to somebody within Hatch in which you talked about what had transpired?
Yes, we can do that.
You can find those.
That's right. We can.
Yeah, we would appreciate that. So apart from the affidavit, if there are emails that you might be able to find which you sent to somebody within Hatch to say, this is what happened in my meeting with Mr. Essa, this is what he said, that would be very helpful.
Chair, we will try and do that, yes.
Okay, all right. Well, the remark by Mr. Essa that Mr. Molefe would be made Group CEO of Eskom is interesting because the CEO of Eskom would have left, or his contract would have ended sometime during 2014, and with effect from 1 October 2014, there was a new group CEO, Mr. Matona, who prior to that had been Director General of the Department of Public Enterprises, but he didn't stay long because in March, he and other executives of Eskom were suspended under circumstances that raise a lot of questions, to say the least. And he sought to go to court to challenge his suspension and wanted to come back. But according to his evidence, he was told by a board member of Eskom, who was delegated together with 2 others to negotiate with him, that the question of him going back to his job at Eskom was out of the question. So they could talk about money, but not him going back. That was March 2015. And he ended up being offered money and he left. And 2 other executives ultimately also left, were offered some money. And Mr. Brian Molefe was seconded to Eskom around April 17, 2015, from Transnet to Eskom to be acting group CEO. A few months later, he was permanently appointed. Okay, I was just mentioning that, so it's interesting that in 2014, towards the end of the year, Mr. Essa said to you, Mr. Molefe would be the next group's CEO for Eskom. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Now, Mr. Bester, what ultimately happened with Hatch's 2 tenders that they submitted for rail and port for phase 2?
So, specifically relating to phase 2, at the time, Hatch decided to not tender on their own, but form a joint venture with 2 other major companies called Oricon and Mott MacDonald. And strategically, that was a decision made purely because looking at the size of the project, the number of people that would have been required to execute the project, the skills that were available in South Africa at the time, specifically relating to the rail and port, and understanding, the amount of work that needs to be done for the 2 projects, it was best to for us, and the strategy taken to go into a joint venture with 2 other companies, which was a massive joint venture, as you can imagine. And we tendered for both, for the rail and the port, which was separately advertised. But we were only informed that we were the preferred bidder for the rail.
Were you informed as to why you were not awarded the port contract?
At the time, we were told by some of the Transnet employees that although we were also the cheapest on the port project, Mr. Anos Singh decided that he's not going to award both projects to us.
And do you know who was awarded the port contract?
Yes, the port project was awarded to a consortium called FLAG, which was also a three-way joint venture between Fluor, AECOM and Okuskip.
Okay, and insofar as Mr. Reddy's company is concerned, what ultimately happened to his company?
So for the phase 2, what was decided, because Hatch now had this experience of the supply and development, and we were now busy with phase 1, executing and understanding how supply and development worked a little bit better. So the first thing obviously that Hatch did was to inform the other partners, the other two partners, about what transpired during phase 1 in terms of specific supply development partners. And it was decided that we will do supply development slightly different in phase 2 with the other companies involved, in that we're going to appoint what we call the lead supply development company, and request that this company also form a joint venture of supply development companies, and they must manage themselves within our bigger contract as a supply development companies. So Mr. Dave Reddy and his company DEC was included in that joint venture. That joint venture was led by Mr. Cello, I can't recall his surname now, but it was also an SD company that we asked that they have a formal contract, obviously a contract with themselves as a joint venture, and then also a contract with us in terms of the scope of the work, the skills, the personnel, and exactly how we're going to execute the works.
Well, what I'm trying to understand is how a company, Mr. Reddy's company, that you were forced by Transnet to include in phase 1, and you successfully resisted that, would end up on phase 2. Was it at the behest of Hatch, or how did it come about that his company ended up there, knowing the history of the introduction and him being told and him telling you under phase 1 that he will participate in the project?
No. So what has happened, so obviously as Hatch we were hesitant to contract with this company, but what we did, and as promised during phase 1 to Mr. Dave Reddy, we will consider him for future work on our terms, for specific scope, etc. So one of our directors at Hatch at the time did a complete due diligence on this company, DEC, which meant that he went to visit their offices, understand their personnel, look at their skills, resources, etc. So that information was conveyed to the other two partners in our joint venture. Everything was above board and transparent on how we communicated that. So it was obviously within a controlled environment that we said, on our terms and under the guidance of this lead supply development company, they could include Mr. Dave Reddy, but it was under their control, and it was for a specific scope and conforming to the fees as per the percentages agreed to with Transnet. So we were comfortable with that arrangement.
So when the due diligence on Mr. Reddy's company was done, what was it found was the skills that his company would be able to contribute on this project insofar as the rail phase is concerned?
Well, the due diligence was basically such that first to establish that he has got an office. Secondly, that he has got some personnel in the office, and then looking at the type of projects that they were doing at the time, the type of personnel, and then obviously because our projects was so big, you must understand that our total tendered amount for phase 2 was in the order of, let's say, 800 million. Now, 30% of 800 million is between 200 and 300 million rand. To find companies at that time to do that amount of work was quite a big task. So for that reason, it was decided that we collect all the names that we were aware of at the time that's in the market, and the skills that the companies had. And that, if I can recall, for Mr. Reddy's company at the time, the specific skills that his company had was for pure civil engineering. So we decided that we can include him and his personnel under that SD umbrella to execute that scope.
Okay, so in a period of less than a year, his company went from not having the required skill set to participate in phase 1 to now Hatch being comfortable under phase 2 that he had the skill set, or was there other factors taken into consideration?
No, remember, it was never because of his skill sets that we not included him in phase 1. It was the manner in which they arrived at our offices and perceived intel information that they had from Transnet, and on the exclusive basis that they wanted us to use them on the phase 1 project. So it was never about the actual skill sets that they had, that we did not include them.
So insofar as he had indicated under phase 1...
I'm sorry.
Chair.
You were uncomfortable previously with them, partly because they appeared to have information that you considered they should not be having.
That's correct.
And they appeared to have a relationship with Mr. Singh, is that correct, that did not sit comfortable with you, is that right?
That's correct.
Why had that discomfort gone away now?
No, Chair, I think the discomfort was always there. We have shared now that information to our 2 other partners, which was Mott MacDonald and Oricon. And they indicated that they would be comfortable if he was included under the controlled environment, because there was nothing onto it at that stage, that was not above board for him to be included. So we still had, as Hatch, obviously we still had that history. Nothing has gone away in terms of what the feeling that we had and the perception that we had about the intel and the events that played off before that time. Everything was shared with the other partners, but it was decided because of the quantum of the work, amount of people that we need, we probably needed all those smaller companies to participate, and it will be in a very controlled environment.
Of course, you would have been aware, would you not, that anyone who knew that you had not included them before because of this discomfort, but now you had included them, even though the discomfort may still have been there, might have the perception that...
Chair, I have to tell you, in tendering for phase 2, and that was quite a lengthy process in which we would have sat every day with our partners in a boardroom environment, calculating what our fees would be, the number of people that we're going to use, what we can pay them in terms of our hourly rate, etc. So when we came to the final amount, exact amount, which I don't have at the moment, but it was in the order of 800 million rand. And when you calculate that supply development component of that, that is a fixed amount. There is no room for maneuver to do anything other than execute work for that and add the value to that percentage. So we were comfortable that we've got that under control, at least from a Hatch perspective. That information was shared, and everybody felt with the contract and the people that we have got for management that everything was above board.
In the meantime, your outstanding invoices, had they been paid?
Chair, I think it was a continuous struggle to get money out of Transnet. I cannot say, sitting in the meetings with Hatch, that invoices were paid then promptly as per contract. I remember it was a continuous struggle.
Well, I was saying that somebody got to know what your attitude had been before towards them, towards including them. And so that subsequently you included them in this one. May have thought or may have the perception that you might have decided to say, let's work with them. Because maybe...
Yeah, Chair, I don't, honestly, our think process would not have been in that vein. For us, it was about the project, the value add, and the manner to which we had control over these people. And it was very important.
You remember I asked you before lunch at some stage whether you had any impression of what message Mr. Salim Essa and Mr. Singh may have been, well, Mr. Singh may have been trying to convey with the delays in paying your invoices and with the manner in which the meeting, which involved Mr. Essa, was handled. It may be that it wasn't this, but it may have been a way of saying, well, if you don't accommodate us, we'll make things difficult for you. Getting payment from us, from Transnet, might be difficult. Did you think about that? Or anybody within Hatch?
Chair, I'm pretty much convinced within Hatch, no. It might have been from the other companies, and at the time, you know, Transnet was quite a major client and a provider of work, so it might have been, I don't know, it's difficult.
Because even from what you have described to me, in terms of the meeting with Mr. Singh and with Mr. Essa, you have used the word in your statement, it was bizarre meeting. It does look quite strange. It does look like there is a subtle message that was being sent to you. What it is might be something else. But you asked for a meeting with Mr. Singh. You come to this meeting, somebody else that you have never met and you have never spoken to takes charge of the meeting, and Mr. Singh has very little to say.
Yes, I agree with you.
You get the impression that this person that you don't know is in charge.
For sure.
And then that person follows up after that with a request to have a follow-up meeting with you. Now, Mr. Singh is no longer there, but he comes, I think, with Mr. Reddy. He comes with Mr. Reddy. So you have kind of seen what relationship he seems to have with Mr. Singh at that meeting. Now he comes with somebody else and he makes certain demands to you. Payment of your invoices continues to be a struggle. So it may be that there was no message, but when one analyzes the whole behavior, it may well have been that there was a message. So when you begin to bring Mr. Reddy in, or to bring them in, somebody might think that they were succeeding in getting you to get them in, even if deep down in your hearts, you actually would prefer to do without them, you know. So, but it might be an unfair suspicion.
Chair, I can understand what you're saying. I agree. For us, clearly in hindsight, there was a message from Mr. Singh as to why he felt comfortable that a person from outside Transnet would sit in a meeting with us, which was totally not acceptable. And then also some of the events that followed, if I can mention that when we were successful with phase 2 on the rail, we had a small function that we arranged where we invited some of the senior people at Transnet just to celebrate this big award to us. And Mr. Singh was also invited, and he was very aggressive
Is that so?
with us. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, you may continue.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Bester, at the time when Hatch had now satisfied itself that Mr. Reddy's company could be included in phase 2 as a SD partner, what projects were you aware of at the time that his company had been involved in and successfully executed?
I cannot recall that detail. All I can recall is that one of our colleagues at Hatch would have been looked at his offices and the skill sets and the type of projects that they were involved with at the time. Because remember, many of these, if not all these supplier development companies, did not necessarily have the skills at the time, or none of them would have had the skills or the people, neither the people at the time. So it was up to us, the bigger consultants and contractors and suppliers, as the objective of supply and development, to grow the skills and resources of these companies and transfer and mentor those people of those companies. So it was merely to understand if the companies exist, if there were offices, and in fact, if they either have or have access to people to do some work.
1 second. Please continue.
Now, if I remember correctly, when we were dealing with phase 1, you said that in your discussion with Mr. Reddy, he said, don't worry, we've got engineers, we can get them from India. And your response to him was, supply development is not about empowering companies in India, it's about a South African initiative. So at that stage, under phase 2, had you satisfied yourself that he now had the necessary skill set that was going to be within South Africa? Because we're talking about less than a year between the two.
That's correct. So I must just remind you also that for phase 2 and the supply development companies that we had, I would doubt it that Mr. Reddy's company had to supply more than 1 or 2 resources. I would think, and thinking back, I think most of the resources came from the other companies that I can recall.
Did that arrangement mean that Reddy's company could be getting paid for doing very little? You maybe being paid more than what it was doing in terms of being able to supply resources, or not necessarily?
Mr. Chair, no, that would have been impossible because people were paid to the resources that were in the office and the actual work performed and how the project was set up and recorded and the work that they did. The output was related to the value add. So there was no inflated values, money. It was not possible at all.
If anybody did little work, they would be paid little, effectively.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Chair. Just following on the Chair's question, out of the amount that was allocated to the SD partners, do you know what proportion went to Mr. Reddy's company?
I don't know.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that it is difficult, Mr. Bester, to reconcile your reluctance under phase 1 to work with Mr. Reddy's company and him ultimately ending up in your phase 2 tender submissions. Would it be fair to say that it's difficult to put the two together?
I cannot agree with that statement because, from our perspective, we would have made 100% sure that how we do business and who we contracting with was totally above board. So yes, what happened in phase 1, as I said again, how the individuals arrived at our offices and the perception that was created was not acceptable to us, purely from how we do business. And then recovering from that position onto phase 2, where we had a better understanding of supply development, having done our own due diligence and how we can control the payments to the supply development company. I mean, we were comfortable that everything was above board.
Okay. Now, when one goes back to the 15 July 2013 meeting between Mr. Basson, Bierman and Singh, where Mr. Singh makes the request to Mr. Basson and Bierman to profile MMQS and DEC to participate in this project. At the end of the day, what we then have is that MMQS does participate via Hatch on phase 1, and DEC does participate via Hatch on phase 2. So when one looks at it, Mr. Singh actually got what he had asked Mr. Basson and Mr. Bierman to investigate right at the outset. Would you agree with that?
No, purely from your statement, I would agree from what you're saying on face value, but I think you have to understand what the original intent was from Mr. Singh to profile these companies or create a perception that they're being profiled, and what his reason would have been to include them. And having had the meeting with Mr. Salim Essa, understanding how he wanted to inflate the contract value, I think that would have been, that would have been the wrong decision to include them on that basis. But we didn't include them on that basis. I mean, we include them pure for the resources and the work that needed to be done. There was a total different agenda behind it in the first place to include these companies, which was different to at the end why we included them.
But you will also accept that they were both companies that you had never previously worked with. And in fact, when we were dealing with phase 1, I took you through all the SD companies that participated on behalf of Hatch as SD partners. And MMQS was the one company that Hatch had never worked with before.
That's correct.
Do you agree with that? And similarly, under phase 2, DEC was not a company that you had previously worked with.
Not as Hatch, but one of our other partners have worked with DEC before.
Now, okay, so between what period? After phase 1, after July 2013 when Padiachi and Reddy approached you, and between the award of phase 2, did one of the companies work in that period, that
Not
year?
necessarily in that period. It might have been before that period, because when the issue was raised with other companies, there was a comment made by one of the directors of McDonald that they know this individual and they have worked with them before. So before might mean a long time before or recently.
Okay, so when you say one of the companies, you mean one of the JV
That's right.
parties?
That's right.
Okay, which
That's
would be
correct.
Mott MacDonald.
That's correct.
Okay, so Mott MacDonald had worked with DEC.
That's correct.
Okay, and do you know what that project was?
No, I cannot recall. You have to do some research on that, but if I can recall the discussion that took place at the time, and if you understand the history of Mott MacDonald in South Africa, it was Mott MacDonald is an international company that actually acquired a local company called PD Naidu and Associates at the time. And from what I understood from one of the directors from Mott MacDonald at the time is that Mr. Dave Reddy was actually, in fact, part of P.D. Naidu and Associates at that time, prior to the acquisition from Mott MacDonald of P.D. Naidu and Associates.
Okay, but Mr. Reddy's company wasn't introduced as a DEC, as a SD partner on phase 2 via Mott MacDonald. It was via Hatch.
No. So what happened is the JV came together, the three companies, and they would have shared between the three companies all the names of SD companies that they were aware of. So obviously Hatch was aware of DEC with the interactions that they had during phase 1, and that name would have been shared with the other companies. And in that one of those meetings, the decision would have been made, it's fine, we can work with this company or his company because we know this individual and we have worked with him before.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to drive at. Who put his name on that list? Was it on the Hatch list or the Mott MacDonald list as one of the companies that would be considered?
Unfortunately, I can't recall exactly if it was because of Hatch or because of Mott MacDonald. It was one of the two companies. I cannot recall, sorry.
Okay. And what happened to MMQS on phase 2?
I don't think at the end they were part of the SD companies that was considered. It might have been that one of the supply development companies, maybe specifically this company, Cello, which was the lead person for the supply development, which was put forward by Mott MacDonald. It might have been that they are, in fact, a quantity surveying company and felt that they don't need another quantity surveying company to help.
But do you know if MMQS was suggested by any one of the JV partners as being on the list to be considered?
I speak on a correction, but that would have been one of the names that obviously that Hatch has put forward because at the time it was one of the companies that worked with us on phase 1.
Okay. Now, when we get to the contract negotiations on phase 2, at page 50 of your statement, from paragraph 72, can you just tell us about what transpired during the contract negotiations, and in your statement you specifically deal with Mckinsey's involvement?
Yes, so we were informed by Transit officially that we are the preferred bidder on the rail portion of the 60 million tons expansion project, and we were invited to attend tender or contract finalization negotiations at a site away from the Transnet offices. So the purpose of this negotiations was to clarify some of the assumptions made in the tender or the uncertainties that was there for either us or Transnet, because we would have had a cover letter where certain assumptions were made and that needed some clarification prior to the contract signature. And every day, the contract negotiations probably went on for 1 month, where every day we would go to this venue, and then there would be a representative at least of each of the JV companies from Hatch, Mott MacDonald and Oricon, plus support people like planners, cost estimators, and other commercial people with us. Myself, I was the project director designate. And then there was the project directors from the Transnet side, the project managers from Transnet Rail side, the supply development leads from Transnet, the commercial people, and every day we had a full agenda of discussions about items that needed to be clarified. So yes, it was during one of these meetings that myself noticed that there was some cables running from microphones like this on the carpet to underneath the door outside to another boardroom. So I inquired about this. I think it was during one of the lunch sessions that I asked the commercial lead from Transnet Capital Projects, Mrs. Corley Janssen van Rensburg, what are these cables? Where are they going? I'm going to go and check what's going on in the other boardroom. And then she said to us, I'm not allowed to go in there because there's Mckinsey people in the room.
She said there's Mckinsey? Doing what?
Yes. So we inquired, we were upset because that was not, we were not informed about this. Firstly, we were not informed that all negotiations were taped or recorded, which we had no problem with, but we were not informed that that is in fact happening. And secondly, we were not informed that there's a room full of Mckinsey people sitting next door. So we asked, what is the purpose of the Mckinsey people? So if I can recall, at the time we were told that Mckinsey was appointed separately from us to oversee independently the contract. That was an appointment made directly by Mr. Anos Singh. They did not have full insight into exactly what their scope of work was and exactly what they do and how they do it. But every day there was apparently a debrief of themselves to Mckinsey and Mckinsey to them about what happened during the day, the negotiations, and then discussion about the next day, what should be asked and how it should be asked. So that was told to us.
And had that previously happened to you in any negotiations with Transnet previously?
Well, previously, not during negotiations. In fact, that was the first time that we had this tense negotiations with Transnet because of the pure size of the contract and the value that was involved. But Mckinsey was always involved in projects that we were doing for Transnet, yes.
Okay, and at some point in your statement at paragraph 73, you talk about Mr. Edward Thomas. Who was Mr. Edward Thomas, and can you just tell us what transpired with him?
So, Mr. Edward Thomas, I couldn't exactly understood his role, but we understood that he reported to Mr. Gary Peter, and that he had to do with supplier development. And I recall during one of the meetings, he was very aggressive with us about our percentages and the partners that we use or don't use. And it was...
Who was that? Who was
Mr.
aggressive?
Edward Thomas.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, it was during this meeting that I decided that we should pack our bags and leave the negotiations.
Okay, why did you decide that?
Because the attitude of Mr. Thomas was very negative. He was very aggressive. In fact, I think he stood up and shouted at us. And I said to the other members of my team and the directors of the other companies that, we shouldn't listen to this unprofessional behavior. Let's go. And we packed our bags and we left.
And you also speak in your statement during the contract negotiations of an encounter with Mr. Velile Sikusana. Can you tell us about that?
That's correct, yes. So as I understood it at the time, he was newly appointed to Transnet, specifically for this project. And he was also one of the individuals that was very aggressive and vocal during negotiations. And he also, at one of the negotiations, made a very funny remark. I cannot recall the exact details. It was something to the effect of, give us 25% discount and then we will consider your contract. So at the time, we thought it was an insult because we spent literally millions preparing this document and tender for Transnet. We know each and every cent how it's going to be spent. And then requesting that type of discount from us had no respect for the input that we made. So I recall he actually phoned me that evening, and he was very aggressive. He used very bad words, told me I better do as I say. Yeah.
And what was Mr. Pieter's demeanor in these negotiations?
Mr. Pieter was actually not involved in the negotiations. Mr. Pieter only became involved in negotiations after we actually left the negotiations. We got a phone call from the procurement lead from Transnet Capital Project at the time, Mrs. Corrie Jansen van Rensburg. I think that is after we had, I cannot recall the exact details, but let's say we were not present there for a few days. She called me and said, can we please come back? And then when we arrived there, Mr. Pieter was there. Okay.
And did you have any interactions with him?
The interactions there was, he asked us just to calm down, because we told him that, you know, we're quite prepared to walk away from this contract the way it's going. The demands are being made, the phone calls that we get, the unprofessional behavior, and we were quite prepared to walk away. And the discussion at the time from us would have been in the vein of, you know, we also then knew at that stage that our tendered amount for the rail alone was something like 150 million rand cheaper or less than the second bidder. So we knew that it's going to be, you know, there's going to be some big explanations in Transnet if we walk away for some other reason that they cannot explain, and why they need to then go and award the contract to the second highest bidder.
Mr. Singh's attitude towards the JV, can you just give us more detail on that?
Yes, as I explained to you, so eventually we got to a point where we agreed on most of the terms, and Transnet decided to award. We had a new managing director for Hatch in Africa, which would have attended the meeting with myself or the function. And Mr. Singh came and he made a short speech. And it was very aggressive and negative towards our consortium. It was a very short speech and strange. And then he walked out. And, you know, even our newly appointed MD asked me, what is this about? Because we came here for celebration, and then we got this very negative words from the CFO from Transnet.
What did you think his attitude towards you was about?
At the time, I think it was a mixed bag of feelings from his side, because obviously what happened during phase one was not to his liking. And the fact that we met with him and Mr. Essa in Melrose Arts, where he was sort of, in my words, reporting to Mr. Essa. I think in his own head he was trying to think what I think or what we think of the situation, and he was just very aggressive. I think things didn't go his way, and he didn't like it.
Okay. Now,
sorry, and then of course there was then the second interaction with him is where he invited myself and the two other directors from the other two companies to the Carlton Center, where we actually signed the contract. And again, I can't remember the exact words, but it was foul language that he used. The language and the moment didn't add up. It was a time to say, congratulations, we're looking forward to work with you type of thing, and it was definitely not like that.
Okay, and then during the execution of the phase 2 project, what was your impression of Mckinsey and your interactions with them?
See, yeah, I mean, prior to the manganese and even in the studies for the leading up to the manganese project, there was a lot of interactions with Mckinsey. As I indicated to you, all the projects that we did, Mckinsey was present. And always we would ask the Transnet people, what they were doing, and nobody could answer us, indicating that Mckinsey was not appointed by them, but or a competitive tendering process. Mckinsey was appointed directly by Anos Singh. I remember one stage I was even told that the CEO of Transnet Freight Rail does not even know about some of the appointments of McKinsey. At the time it was Siyabonga Gama, and I was told that Mr. Gama doesn't agree on some of these appointments with Mr. Singh. So the interactions was always a very strange interaction, because we had no direct interaction with them. But it was strange because we would have been the technical people on the project, requiring some feedback to Transnet, and we were never invited to give feedback to Transnet. It was always McKinsey that had to go and give feedback to Transnet on our behalf. We did not even know what the feedback is that they were given.
Did you know what role McKinsey was to play on the project?
I was told that, well, first of all, I was told that their appointment on this specific project was in excess of 300 million rand. I was told that they have an oversight role, and the exact scope of that detail and what they need to do for that money, the Transnet people couldn't tell us. In fact, the Transnet people told us they were also not told what McKinsey is doing. They were only told that McKinsey is going to be on the project.
Now, what would you have expected from a company that's playing an oversight role on this project?
Well, for us, the oversight role would have been to understand, the work that we do, to understand our processes and procedures, and to match the effort that we have in executing the project to the output, to have some involvement in our invoices and how that relates to the deliverables that we put on the table, the scope of work. Thank you. The tracking of the project and the progress with where we are in terms of the invoicing. And I can remember at some stage we did a value engineering exercise to see how we can further cut cost on the manganese in terms of the actual spending of the capital spending. And we were in a session with McKinsey, and I can clearly recall we were asked the most embarrassing simple questions about the project, which we thought it is of technical people that doesn't understand what the project is about. For us, it was also a big disappointment at the time.
In other words, what you would have expected a company that's playing an oversight role to know?
Yes.
Okay.
So at least expect exactly to know the detail of the project and what needed to be done. But, it's if you understand rail engineering and the type of work that we did at the time, the dynamic simulations and how that relates to the rolling stock, which is the power and the amount that needs to be bought, and how everything comes together. And, for us, McKinsey couldn't put those elements together.
Had you done similar projects before? Had you been involved in the same type of work before? Hatch?
We've done a lot of these projects.
Yes.
Yes.
Was it normal for there to be somebody appointed to perform an oversight role while you were doing a job like this?
It was the first time for us that we had
yes, to have somebody supervising
oversight consultants looking after us.
Yes. Do you know whether they had, McKinsey had the qualifications and experience to play that role in regard to this type of work, or is that something you didn't know?
Chair, to be honest with you, the interactions that I personally had with the McKinsey people at the time during the execution of the manganese project, and what they told me their qualifications was not technical, it was more financial and commercial. I recall at some stage, they told us that they are going to use a rail expert. I couldn't recall from which country. But it was also not applicable to the South African rail conditions and the type of rail that we use.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. That's the evidence of Mr. Bester, unless Chair has any further questions for him.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bester. You do recall you have some homework to do for the Commission in terms of emails and the affidavit.
Yes, I do.
The legal team and the investigators would also be following up. But do have a look and see what you can find. There may have been some emails that you sent to colleagues soon after that meeting with Mr. Essa and Mr. Reddy. And also there may have been some emails that you may have sent to colleagues when you had the announcement of Mr. Brown Molefe as Group CEO of Eskom. You might have sent somebody a message to say, oh, so Mr. Essa was right, or something like that. So do look for such emails, and if they exist, they might assist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
You are now excused.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, the next witness is Ms. Deandre Stratum, and Mr. Myberg will be leading her evidence.
Okay, thank you. Do you need 5 minutes to move things around or not really?
Yes, please, Chair.
Okay,
We're indebted to
we'll
you.
adjourn for about 5 minutes. We adjourn. Okay, let's continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is our next witness, Deandre Stratum. Her affidavit is found in file 4A, exhibit BB20, immediately behind Mr. Bester's statement. Mr. Chairperson.
Thank you. I found it. Please administer the oath of affirmation.
Please state your full names for the record.
Deandre Stratum?
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
Yes.
Do you swear that the evidence will give it with the truth, the whole truth, and nothing else but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
You might wish to sit on the other chair, Mr. Drix, for your convenience, because that's the mic that works, I think. Yes, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Stratum, you will have open in front of you Exhibit 20. Could I ask you please to turn to page 133? Would you confirm that that is the beginning of your affidavit?
Yes.
And could you then please turn forward to the end of that affidavit, which you find at page 157. Is that your signature?
Yes.
And did you depose to this affidavit under oath on the 9th of October this year, 2020?
Yes.
Attached to this affidavit are 8 annexures, commencing with annexure DS1 at page 159 and ending with annexure DS.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mavek. I didn't hear Ms. Stratum respond. I think her voice is very soft. Did you confirm that it's the first signature on page 157 is your signature?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah, try and raise your voice. Okay.
So, Ms. Stratum, what you need to do, one is to raise your voice, and secondly, when you answer the questions, don't look at me, look at the chairperson. You're addressing him. I'm just a bystander. All right. So annexure DS1 you find at 159, and annexure DS8 you find the conclusion of your annexures at page 217. Would you confirm that?
Yes.
All right, let us go back to the beginning of your affidavit. And I just want you to confirm that you testify here this afternoon under subpoena issued by the Commission.
That's correct, yes.
Now, if I could take you please to paragraph 5. What is your current position at Transnet?
I'm currently an executive manager in the strategy and planning, group strategy and planning department within the capital development function.
And it seems from paragraph 6 that you've been employed by Transnet for a long time, commencing in 1991. Is that so?
That's correct, yes.
You set out in
Probably was your first job?
Yes.
You set out in paragraph 7 all 14 different positions that you've held at Transnet, commencing as a researcher. If you look at page 136, paragraph 7.1, rising up, as we see at paragraph 7.1, to the executive manager position that you've described.
Yes. That's correct, yes.
Paragraph 7.3 and 7.4, there you held the position of Program Director, Manganese Expansion, and then Executive Manager, Strategy and Long-Term Planning, Capital Expansion Project. Are those the two positions that you held during the time that is relevant to your evidence, when you were involved in the manganese expansion project?
Yes.
Is there an error in that heading that refers to expansation? Manganese expansation project.
Yes, I see.
It should be expansion. Is that correct, Ms. Stratum? Just above paragraph 9?
Above paragraph?
Just above paragraph 9 of your affidavit.
Yes, that is an
error.
It has to
Okay.
be.
Okay.
All right. So let us deal, thank you, Chairperson. Let us deal with the manganese expansion project, which we know goes by the acronym MEP. And you start off by dealing with your role. Now, you've already told the Chairperson that you were appointed as Executive Manager in TRF Strategy and Long-Term Planning. That is a role that you held during the MEP, is that so?
That is correct.
And in a nutshell, what did your responsibilities include? What did the role involve? What did the position entail? Things that you deal with in paragraphs 9, 10, and 11.
The position entailed the scoping and development of various capital expansion initiatives for Transnet, including the MEP or the Manganese Expansion Program, Waterberg Expansion Program, Eskom Program. In this role, I was the Transnet Freight Rail owners' representatives, as the projects of this nature typically was handled by Transnet Capital Projects, especially where there were multi-divisional projects, so therefore rail and port projects involved. I had no commercial delegation in this role, as the commercial authority resided with TCP.
Then at paragraph 13, you deal with the makeup of the MEP steering committee. Who sat on that committee, Mrs. Stratum?
MEP steering committee comprised of Mr. Anash Singh, Mr. Siyabonga Gama, who was the chief executive of TFR, amongst others, and then also the other operating division chief executives.
And you mention in that paragraph that the steering committee endorsed the creation of the position that you then came to hold, that of program director. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
You mention over the page that you were then appointed into that position, and we know from your CV set out at paragraph 7 that was in November 2014. Would you confirm that?
Yes, confirm that.
And in that position of program director, to whom did you initially report?
I initially reported to Anash Singh and was subsequently reassigned to report to Mr. Mohammed Mohammadi, who was heading up Group Capital Integration and Assurance at that stage, which was a department that Anash Singh created around about end of 2011.
And essentially, what was your role in this position of program director? Was it different to the one that you had occupied before?
It was similar in that I had to finalize the preparation of the integrated business case and then also prepare the business case and for approvals through the necessary approving committees through to the Department of Public Enterprises, which was the approving authority, according to the delegation of authority framework that Transnet had from a PFMA perspective at that point.
And that we know goes by the acronym of DPE.
That's correct, yes.
At paragraph 15, you deal with Mckinsey. Could you describe, please, to the chairperson your involvement and experience with Mckinsey? And it's a topic that we return to later in your affidavit.
Yes, Mckinsey, right throughout my involvement in the manganese expansion, was heavily involved in the project, in all elements of scrubbing the project, so looking at the costs of the project, They also were involved in describing the role of the program director, which was a new role in Transnet. And then they were also involved in assisting with the development of the business case. Yeah, so all aspects of the project, commercial execution, they were involved in.
And who was McKinsey appointed by, and to whom did they report?
They were appointed by Anash Singh. They reported into the group capital GCIA structure at that stage. And it was very clear to us that the reporting lines through GCIA was directly to Mr. Singh as the team.
Did you feel at liberty at this time to question the work of McKinsey?
No, not at all.
Why do you say that?
They were basically in charge of the development of the business case. They vetoed or approved anything that we did, any strategy, any assessment was vetoed by them. They prepared reports for Mr. Singh on a weekly basis. We had to prepare our own reports, and then I used to call it Truth and Reconciliation on a Friday, because what they contained in their reports was always contradictory to ours. So we had no authority to work outside, almost of the McKinsey authority.
Did you say whatever they did was contrary to what you did, or what?
Yeah, they would, yes, often.
They would go a different direction. If you were going that way, they would go that way, or something like that, on whatever document or issues you were dealing with.
Often on reports in terms of project progress, we would prepare a report based on evidence, and they would put a different view on the table that to some degree discredit the work that the team did.
Or they were critical of your...
Very critical of it, and it created
of your work.
a distrust
Yeah.
of the team, yes.
Yes. Okay, all right.
Thank you, Chairperson. Then you go on to say at paragraph 16 that in May of 2014, the then Minister of Public Enterprises, Mr. Malusi Gigaba, approved the business case. Is that the business case that you had been working on together with McKinsey?
That's correct, yes.
And you make a comment that with hindsight you felt this strange. Why do you say that?
The business case was approved within 2 months, compared to a similar major expansion where the approval was in excess of 2 years.
And you refer to that not as strange, as I said, but as suspicious. Why
Yes.
did you consider that suspicious?
Approval of, for an approval of this value, to receive that in such a short time, first of all, was suspicious. Yeah, it begged the question in terms of, did everybody apply their minds to the information in such a short period? I was also informed by General Manager, Head of Commercial, Mr. Debesh Kalan at that stage, whom I worked with in terms of pricing and the commercial strategy for the business case, that the business case will be approved. We shouldn't worry as the project team, because it was close to elections. Elections that year was May 2014, I think scheduled for that. And there was a risk that if this business case is not approved, there might be a change of minister or cabinet or personnel. So his view was that it will definitely be approved.
You then, at paragraph 18, talk about the recommendation to centralize all delegations for capital execution within the program structure. Could you deal with that, please, and the significance of it?
Yeah. The McKinsey developed a a standard for capital execution for Transnet called the Platinum Standard, which recommended for a program of this nature and size that all the expenditure, so capital expenditure for rail and port, should be centralized. So there should be, from a group perspective, a central authority who is then responsible for the management of the capital, oversight of the capital expenditure, reporting, etc. This was in contradiction to the practice at Transnet at that stage, where all of the operating divisions were respectively and individually accountable for the management of the capital expenditure associated with projects. The operating divisions resisted this change because effectively it would have meant that they would have lost control of the capital expenditure from an operating division perspective as it would have been centralized. So therefore, although the Platinum Standard recommended that as program director, I should have control over capital expenditure, that did not happen. Therefore, in the program director role, I eventually did not have any financial delegation.
You go on to mention then at paragraph 19 that there was a change in your reporting line. So you've explained how you reported first to Mr. Singh, then to Mr. Mohammadi. Who did you land up reporting to?
I finally ended up reporting into group planning directly to Mr. Krish Reddy, who was the general manager of group planning at that stage. They established similar roles to the program director roles for multi-divisional programs, especially for the concept and pre-feasibility phases of those programs. So it was a natural fit.
Mrs. Stratum, you then deal with the motivation for the MEP, and you do that over pages 140 and 141. Could you just give the chairperson a thumbnail sketch of the motivation of the MEP?
We concluded an investment in expanding manganese export capacity to the port of PE, bulk terminal in PE, to 5.5 million tons in 2009. And despite that capacity that we offered, there was just an increase, an exponential need for export capacity from industry. South Africa at that stage had developed China as a very lucrative market because our manganese, the quality of our manganese was very suited to their smelters and furnaces. So we immediately started with a project. We validated demand with customers, with industry, and then commenced with a project to understand where are we going to create additional export capacity in South Africa. At that stage, the PE bulk terminal reached the footprint, so the size of the terminal could not be expanded further. So we knew that we reached a capacity cap there. It was also a very old terminal. I think it was built in the 60s, and there were many environmental issues with the terminal and commitments to vacate the terminal at some point, close the terminal. And therefore, we commenced with the feasibility studies to look at where do we create the next export channel for manganese in South Africa.
And what decision was made? Where was that expansion to take place?
On conclusion of the feasibility studies, a decision was made to proceed with an expansion through the port of Coega. Comparisons there were studies done looking at Saldanha as an option, heavy ore line through to Saldanha. From a timing perspective, so from a completion date perspective, Coega was the better option. We could meet or provide capacity to industry ahead of demand much earlier than what Saldanha would have offered at that stage. And on that basis, and Saldanha also had many environmental issues that they were facing, we recommended that we proceed with the feasibility studies for the port of Coega.
And how many million tons per annum were you looking then to expand to?
To 16 million tons, based on the validated demand from industry.
From how many in Port Elizabeth?
From 5.5 million tons in the bulk terminal to a total of 16.
If we have a look at paragraph 23, you talk there about the Transnet market demand strategy, known by the acronym MDS. Could you address that, please?
Transnet market demand strategy was in response to economic growth plans, and it was aimed at expanding, modernizing rail and port infrastructure and pipeline infrastructure in South Africa in order to meet the requirements to support economic growth. The main pillar of the MDS, the market demand strategy, was a 300 billion rand investment program associated with the delivery of assets.
And was this then the MEP, was it part of that program?
Yeah. The manganese expansion was the anchor program in the MDS. It was the biggest expansion that Transnet was going to undertake in the MDS, yes.
You go on to say that in May of 2014, Transnet received approval in accordance with the PFMA to proceed with the investment. From whom did you receive that approval?
We received the approval from the Minister of Public Enterprises, so the Department of Public Enterprises, our shareholder, in accordance with the PFMA, the Delegation of Authority Framework.
And you attached that approval as Annexure DS2?
That's correct, yes.
Could we then please go to the various project phases? And again, if I could just ask you to outline this and perhaps to focus on those phases that are relevant to the balance of your evidence.
Transnet adopted, given the quantum of investment that we were envisaging, a process to standardize the execution of capital projects and to create a consistent approach to that execution was developed. This process is called the Project Lifecycle Process, known as the PLP in Transnet. The notion of the PLP is the more work you can do in the early phases of a project, and we call that front-end loading, the more work you can do to develop the solution, refine the cost estimates, etc., and reduce risk, therefore, the higher the likelihood is that you will deliver a successful project at the end of it. So on that basis, the PLP has 5 phases. FEL1, or front-end loading 1, is where you have a basic business need that you have to address and you identify all the options that could solve it. Ones that are then have fatal flaws, you then put aside. FEL2 is a pre-feasibility where you do further work on the potential options. So you start doing early engineering work around it, and based on the outcomes of the FEL2, you recommend a go-forward option. In FEL3, which is your feasibility phase, you then do detailed engineering of that. So you do your detailed costing, you do your environmental authorizations, so all the necessary work that needs to go in to inform your business case so that the estimates in your business case are accurate. And then in FEL4, any element that has a remaining design component, you finalize there. So you finalize your designs early in FEL4 and then you execute the project, which is then the capital execution, construction aspect of the project. FEL5 is when you close it out. So once the asset has been delivered, you close out the project.
All right. And then you deal with something that, as I understand, you've already touched on, the platinum standard for capital execution. Is there anything there you want to reiterate or expand upon?
No, I think only to mention that in supporting the MDS, the capital expansion program attempted also to make sure that the capital portfolio and the delivery of projects meet the business needs as they were set out. So, apologies. It was to manage the risks associated with the execution of the capital portfolio appropriately, so defining all the standards and frameworks required for that.
Now, Mrs. Stratum, you mentioned at the beginning of your affidavit that MEP was split into 2 different phases. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And you then, that's phase 1 and phase 2. You at page 12 commenced dealing with phase 1. And you've described already what your role was in that. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
So can we then pick up at paragraph 32 and deal with Hatch Goba, their appointment and what they did, and how they came ultimately to be appointed?
In 2011, Transnet Capital Projects appointed Hatch Goba. It was under the Hatch McDonald Goba contract at that stage, which was a Transnet contract, to proceed with the pre-feasibility studies for the manganese expansion to the port of Coega. So Hatch was involved in finalizing those studies, and they were concluded towards the end of 2012.
Yes, please carry on.
The full 16 million tonnes expansion was a material expansion. The value in excess of 27 billion and much higher. So given the quantum of the investment, it was recommended that we need to subject the full expansion to further scrubbing to see if we could potentially bring some of the costs down. And on that basis, the Transnet Capital Investment Committee then in 2012 supported the ring fencing of aspects of the full expansion. Specifically on the rail side, there were projects that would have been executed that had safety and operational capacity implications that couldn't stand over for the duration of this scrubbing period, especially from a safety perspective. And we also had the environmental authorizations in place for those projects. That was approved, or they supported that, the splitting of the scope, and the project then was renamed Rail Phase 1.
So that's how phase 1 came about.
Yes.
And you mentioned at the end of paragraph 33, the project was named Rail Phase 1 of MEP Phase 1.
That's correct, yes.
And then you go on to mention that there was a confinement of the engineering, procurement and construction management scope, known as EPCM. Please address that.
That is correct. A risk review was conducted by TCP, and based on the risk review, a motivation was prepared to confine the EPCM scope of work to Hatch, and the request to confine was then submitted for approval. A confinement is done under certain circumstances, and the confinement, the motivation dealt with those circumstances.
Can you recall why the decision was made to opt for confinement in relation to Hatch?
Yes. The main decision being that Hatch had completed all the pre-feasibility studies, so they were familiar with the detailed designs and engineering designs required for the rail scope of work at that stage. It was extension of loops mainly, or rail passing loops mainly, and it would not make sense to bring another company on board at that stage who has to basically start from scratch. So from a timing perspective, given the safety and operational criticality of the specific projects in Phase 1, a motivation to confine was therefore prepared.
What was the value of that transaction, the Hatch confinement?
The value of the transaction was below 250 million.
And in those circumstances, who had approval authority?
When a confinement, according to the delegation of authority, was below 250 million, the group chief executive at that stage, Mr. Brian Molefe, had full authority to approve the confinement.
And was anything in that regard reported to you by, or mentioned to you by any of your colleagues?
Yes, Mr. Ruri Basson, who was General Manager at TCP, overseeing the manganese expansion at that stage, told me that they had to reduce the estimated cost or value of the confinement to fit in with the delegated authority limit of the GCE at that stage. So therefore, it meant that you had the full delegated authority to approve it. It did not have to go to the Board Acquisition and Disposal Committee for approval, which would be the next authority.
You go on to say at the end of that paragraph, I annex here to mark DS3, the approval of the confinement of phase 1 to Hatch with an approved contract value of 220 million, as well as the delegation of authority. Can I take you to those documents, please? Could you turn to page 179, 179? And that is a memorandum from Mr. Charles Moller. Who was he?
Mr. Charles Moller was the head of, or group executive head of Transit Capital Projects at that stage.
And he's writing to Mr. Molefe.
Yes.
And the subject is confinement and award of the FEL4 EPCM service to Hatch Goba for phase 1 of the manganese 16 MTPA TFR project. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And the purpose is stated as being to obtain approval from the group chief executive, Transnet SOC Limited, for confinement and award of the EPCM services for FEL4 phase 1, and then the project is described. So this is a memorandum where the approval of Mr. Molefe was sought.
That is correct, yes.
If we then go to the end of this memorandum, at page 185, we will see that it's recommended by a series of persons. Mr. Gerard Bierman, we'll come to him in some time. Mr. Moller, you've mentioned. Mr. Gama, Mr. Mohammadi, Mr. Gary Peter, Mr. Anoj Singh, and then finally Mr. Brian Molefe. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And he appears to have signed on the 19th of August 2013.
Yes.
And then if we go to the next annexure, which you mentioned, that being annexure DS4, at page 187, you want to point out to the chairperson the GCE's approval authority in terms of this matrix?
If you follow the matrix where you see, and the heading being the approval to approach market for confinement, if you look at under the GCE's delegation, it will be for up to but not exceeding 250 million. And the limits are per transaction.
And sorry, I should have pointed out, if you go back to page 185, under the heading recommendation, there's a series of bullet points. The first is value of the contract not to exceed 220 million.
That's correct, yes.
Could we then please go back to your affidavit, page 14, paragraph 36. And this is the first time, Mrs. Stratum, that you mention and begin to deal with the concept of supplier development targets, which
That's
are
correct.
referred to by the acronym SD.
I'm sorry, Mr. Michael, you said we go back to what page
Page 146, paragraph 36, Mr. Chair.
of her statement?
Yes, I beg your pardon.
Okay, thank you.
Here you deal with the concept of supply development SD targets. Could you please just explain in the first instance to the chairperson what they involve before we get to the detail of the target set in this instance?
Transnet had adopted the supply development program, which was part of the competitive supply development program of DPE. And I think to create capacity, capability, and grow the supply base. And also to a very large degree transform the supply base to Transnet and other SOCs. They do this through their procurement programs or procurement initiatives. And for a specific type of project, so for instance, this is engineering EPCM professional services, there would be an acceptable target depending on the size of the market, etc. So market research done. So the introduction of SD targets in this project was therefore based on the EPCM project and what the supplier development initiatives are that Transnet wanted the EPCM to focus on.
So what was the SD target for phase 1?
The initial target, so the first document that I took through for approval, as per my role, to Siyabonga Gama, was 40%, which is the first document that he signed. In subsequent documents, so the final document that was submitted for approval to the Group Chief Executive, the SD value was increased to 50%, which was very high.
We'll come to those documents, but practically speaking, what did it mean, a 50% SD target?
50% of the contract value had to be earmarked for supplier development, which can be a combination of contracting specific earmarked companies.
All right. Now, you say at the end of paragraph 36 that you refer to Annexure DS5 and then back to Annexure DS3. Can we turn, please, to, I beg your pardon, Annexure DS5 at page 189. Now, this is a memorandum dated the 31st of July. And if I could take you, please, to page 195 at the end, you see that it's signed by Mr. Gama. Is this the document that you say you took to Mr. Gama to sign?
That's correct, yes.
And could I please direct your attention to paragraph 29 at page 194. It says, SD will be implemented in the form of a pre-qualification criteria as well as a threshold. And 30, the minimum pre-qualifying criteria of 40% of contract value will be allocated to SD-related initiatives.
That is correct, yes.
That, you say, bears out your evidence that initially the target was 40%.
That is correct.
And then if we go back to DS3, that you find at page 184, 184. There you will see in the subsequent memorandum that was approved by Brian Malefe, at paragraph 30, the minimum pre-qualifying criteria of 50% of the contract value will be allocated to SD-related initiatives. So between these two memorandum, it was increased by 10%.
That is correct, yes.
And then perhaps, if I could ask you also to look at page 185, Under the heading Recommendation, in paragraph 35, the second bullet point under the contract value is SD pre-qualification of 50% be met.
Yes.
Confirm that?
I confirm that that was in the final recommendation, yes.
And incidentally, Mrs. Stratum, what does this pre-qualification, that term, what does it mean?
The contractor or the EPCM contractor had to have evidence of projects, partners or contracted work to the value of 50% of the value of the total contract. To be considered, so the SD pre-qualification, that is the primary qualification before you go forward and then consider the technical aspects of any bid. So they had to be able to provide evidence of initiatives, contracts, etc., to the value of 50% of the total contract value of 220 million at that stage.
At paragraph 37 of your affidavit, you then talk of a meeting that you held. Do you recall that meeting?
Yes.
In late July.
Yes, I can recall the meeting, yeah.
In late July, were the contract negotiations underway?
Yes.
In respect of phase one?
Yes. So it was in the contract negotiations were underway, and it was in the process of concluding the final price for the EPCM work that had to be done.
And that's with Hatch?
That's with Hatch, yes.
Now, who attended this meeting that you speak of?
At the meeting, it was myself, Mr. Investor from Hatch, the Hatch project director for rail at that stage, and as well as Rudy Basson.
Just remind us of Mr. Basson's position, please.
Mr. Basson at that stage was a general manager in Transnet Capital Projects, and he was responsible for the manganese execution. It was his responsibility.
How did this meeting come about? How did you come to participate in this meeting?
I can't recall specifically. We would have either been invited by Mr. Bester to attend the session. We were working fairly closely with Hatch at that stage on completing the feasibility studies. So it would have either been a phone call to attend a meeting, or we would have been, together with Rudy, we would have been in Woodmead for other meetings.
All right, well, just as I understand it, where were your offices at the time?
In Woodmead.
And where were Hatch's offices?
In Woodmead as well.
All right. So you attend this meeting together with Mr. Basson and Mr. Henk Bester?
Yes.
And what transpired during the course of that meeting?
At the meeting, Mr. Bester indicated to us that he was approached by persons, one of them being Mr. Dave Reddy, and Mr. Reddy indicated or was quite adamant that Mr. Bester had to appoint his company as the SD partner for phase one. I did not know Mr. Reddy. It was news to me.
And when did you first meet Mr. Reddy?
I met him the following year, in June 2014, at a client function that Hatch Goba arranged.
Now, you've said in your evidence that Mr. Bester explained that he had been approached by persons, one of whom was Mr. Reddy. Can you remember the names of any other persons that he mentioned?
No, unfortunately not. I can recall Mr. Reddy's name because I met him the following year. Unfortunately, not the other persons. And
can you recall, insofar as it may have been mentioned, the name of Mr. Reddy's company who was put forward as a SD partner?
Unfortunately not. I cannot recall the detail. I can recall the name of the person, but not the details of the company.
Did you come, we'll come further to that in your affidavit, but did you come to learn of the name of that company later on?
Mr. Reddy's...
Yes. Did you subsequently come to learn of the name of his company?
Yes, later on.
But you didn't know about it
Not-
at this
yes,
time?
Yes. I didn't know who he was, and I didn't know which company he represented. It was
So
known
you
to me.
say that Mr. Bester explains to you that he'd been approached by persons including Mr. Reddy, and he was adamant that he should be appointed as an SD partner. What else, if anything, did Mr. Bester tell you?
Mr. Bester indicated to us that Mr. Reddy claimed to know very important people. He spoke about number one, whoever number one was, people very high up in Transnet. And of concern was that he knew everything about the project at that stage.
Yes.
And given that it was a confinement, that was quite strange, that information would be available externally. He then also said to us that following this meeting with Mr. Reddy, Hatch's meeting with Mr. Reddy, they were sent an MOU, which they were then asked to sign, to the effect that they should be the SD partner on phase one.
Was Mr. Bester at all concerned about this? I mean, What
Yes.
gave rise to the meeting? Why did he want to meet?
He was very concerned about it because, first of all, as said, it is a confinement, so the information about the project should not be available in the public domain. And secondly, the assertions that Mr. Reddy made, that he knew important people in Transnet, and that he was acting with the authority, basically. So acting with the authority of Anosh Singh in executing this. So it was highly concerning.
Now, what did, perhaps I can start off by asking you, did Mr. Besson then respond to this once he heard this report?
Yes, he was very surprised. He said that
So,
they had
Ms.
a
Stratum,
meeting,
please
so-
speak up a little. I'm struggling to hear you.
Mr. Besson was surprised. He said that Gerard Bierman and himself had a meeting with Anosh Singh, the Chief Financial Officer at that stage. And Anosh basically wanted them to include this company, or Dave Reddy's company, in the confinement documents as SD partners, so to prescribe it. And they basically said to Anosh, that cannot be done. You cannot prescribe who the SD partners must be. And because of that advice to Anosh, they thought that the matter was dealt with. So he was very surprised that despite this, Dave Reddy then approached Hatch directly.
You've now mentioned the name of Gerard Bierman. Who was he?
Gerard Bierman was the Chief Financial Officer of TCP, apologies, of TCP at that stage. Thank you. Of capital projects. Yeah.
So perhaps you could just assist and paint the picture for us. Here we have, you've got yourself, you've got Mr. Besson, you've got Mr. Bierman. How did those three positions fit in? How were they connected? So you're the project director.
I'm the Transnet because it's a rail project.
Yes.
I'm the Transnet Freight Rail. I'm the owner's representative from the operating division's perspective, so Transnet Freight Rail. Rudy Basson is appointed as General Manager Transnet Capital Projects to execute the project for and on behalf of the operating division, so the capital execution.
As you've explained, that's where the
Correct.
capital comes from.
Yes.
All right, yes.
And Gerard Bierman was the Chief Financial Officer of TCP. And if I can
So
recall...
the Chief Financial
Yeah.
Officer of Capital Projects.
Of capital projects.
Right. So did Mr. Besson report to him?
No.
They perform different roles.
They perform different roles. Gerard looking after obviously the finances of TCP, and I think to a large degree also oversight of procurement. To that.
And as I understand your evidence, Mr. Besson mentioned to you that he and Mr. Bierman had held this discussion with Mr. Singh that you've described?
That's correct. They were called by Mr. Singh to discuss this, and they indicated to him that you cannot do this.
And on what basis then was this meeting concluded?
We concluded, and I know my recommendation, our recommendation was that Hatch should not sign that MOU. That was my specific advice to them. I suspected that something was going on.
What do you mean?
Twofold, the fact that there was this approach from Dave Reddy requesting to be appointed as SD partner outside a process, and then the fact that the SD targets were manipulated, in my view, prior to the completion or the signing of the final memo, from 40 to 50%, which is a very, very high SD target for a project of this nature.
You say now that you thought that something was going on in your affidavit. You talk about having suspected that corruption was at play.
Correct, yes.
Now, I'd asked you how the meeting concluded, and you say that your advice was that Hatch should not sign the MOU.
Yes, as the freight rail owner's representative, and it being a rail capital, my recommendation was do not sign
Yes,
the memo,
was
the MOU. Yeah.
driving at another
Okay.
point, and that is,
Yeah.
what, if anything, was Mr. Besson's recommendation?
I cannot recall. I know, given that he was surprised that Dave Reddy approached them despite the discussion with Anosh. I think based on my view as being the owner's representative, Rudy agreed with us that Hatch should not sign that MOU.
All right. So that is a meeting that you say you participated in late July of 2013. You go on at paragraph 38 to speak of a telephone call that you received on the evening of the 6th of August 2013. Do you
That's
recall that telephone call?
Yes. I
Who
can
phoned
recall.
you?
Mr. Invester called me that evening, and he advised me that after the meeting we had, where we concluded that they shouldn't sign, Mr. Besson called him and requested Hatch to sign the MOU. Hatch then signed a version that they amended, which was a more general, broad MOU. Despite that, they were then requested to sign an addendum to that MOU. So there was a back and forward of documents, and the response from Dave Reddy continuously was to reintroduce.
But what gave rise to Mr. Bester phoning you on the evening of the 6th of August? Was he concerned at all?
He was concerned. In my opinion, the fact that we concluded that he shouldn't sign and then received a call from Mr. Besson, who was from TCP responsible for execution, instructing him to sign the MOU.
Yes. So he signed an amended version, and now they were being required to sign an addendum.
To sign an addendum.
Was he concerned about that?
Yes.
Why was he concerned?
Because the addendum again instructed them to include Dave Reddy's company or this company as SD partner on phase one. So whereas they wanted to keep the MOU as a broad MOU, the addendums continued to be brought back to SD.
And what would the consequences be of not signing the addendum? Was that something that he raised with you?
He indicated to me that the tone of this discussion, the toing and throwing of the addendums, got to a point where it was fairly aggressive, and that they were being threatened to toe the line effectively and sign the revised addendum.
Could you please look at the last 2 or 3 lines of your affidavit?
Yeah. Yes. And I think specifically the fact that they did the amendments to the addendum to include the ST partner was linked to the fact that the confinement won't be approved if they did not sign that. So the confinement documents that were with Anosh Singh at that stage, because he was one of the main signatories, would not be approved if they did not sign the amendment to include Dave Reddy's company into the project as a ST partner.
And who would have been, or we've seen the signatures, but who was the ultimate approval authority for the confinement?
It would be Mr. Brian Molefe in line with the delegation of authority at that stage.
You say that he reported to you that Hatch was now being required to sign an addendum to it against, as you put it, the thinly veiled threat by Reddy of the confinement otherwise not being approved by Transnet.
That is correct, and approval being Anosh Singh and Mr. Brian Molefe at that stage.
What impression, Mrs. Stratum, did you form when you were told that despite the events of the July meeting that you had held with Mr. Besson, Mr. Bester was now reporting to you that Mr. Besson had in fact requested Hatch to sign the MOU?
I understood that Hatch initially signed an MOU, or Hatch was approached by Dave Reddy, and MOU was put forward. And in that MOU, it indicated that Dave Reddy they've established a JV to work with Hatch. Hatch then prepared.
Sorry, I'm not driving at that. We know the facts.
Yeah.
But what impression did you form of Mr. Besson?
What concerned me was the fact that he agreed to, jointly with us, that Hatch should not sign that MOU.
Yes.
And then later that evening, that same, or after that meeting, instructed Mr. Bester to sign the MOU.
Yes.
Which could, in my opinion, mean that there was undue pressure put on him to sign the MOU from someone. Now, I don't have that detail about who that someone could be.
So that's a telephone call on the
Yes.
6th of August. What happened the next day, the 7th of August?
So after what transpired, the telephone call, the next day I met with Henk Bester and Alan Gray, who was his boss at that stage, to discuss the matter.
Why did you have this meeting?
Because of the concerns raised by Hatch with the pressure being put on them to sign an MOU, which they weren't comfortable with, and I think because of the fact that clearly with the instruction to Rudy to sign a document, someone could have been compromised.
So that's
Yeah.
why you had the meeting.
Yes.
Did you come then, and perhaps you can have a look at paragraph 39 of your affidavit, to learn of further information at this meeting?
Yes.
Could you explain that, please?
At the meeting, Hatch indicated to me that they were now requested to sign this revised MOU. So they prepared a broad one. There was a revised one. They were requested to sign a revised MOU. Hatch then...
Sorry, I thought they were being required to sign an addendum.
Yeah. So, yes.
Let's just get the terms right.
Correct. Hatch,
There was an MOU,
which Hatch prepared, which was a broad MOU. Correct.
there was an MOU, there was then a revised MOU,
Yes.
which they signed.
Yes.
They were now being, as I understand your evidence, being required to sign an addendum.
Addendum to the revised MOU. Yes, that's correct.
So you say in the second sentence, during the course of the meeting, they mentioned to me that they had signed the revised MOU
Yes.
and were now being required to sign an addendum.
That's correct, yes.
Carry on. What else did you come to learn?
They were being asked to sign the addendum. And in the addendum, the JV had to be appointed by Hatch as the ST partner in phase 1.
All right. What did you then do after having come to learn of this?
I was very concerned about what was going on and what transpired. Specifically, as indicated, Rudy Basson's response and instruction to sign the MOU. I discussed the matter with one of my colleagues at TFR, Johan Bauer. He was executive manager in the finance division in TFR.
Sorry, can you please speak up?
Sorry. So I discussed the matter with Johan Bauer. He was executive manager at TFR in the finance division at that stage, and responsible for governance related to capital management.
Right. And what caused you to approach Mr. Bauer?
The fact that Hatch was asked, or they was almost being forced to sign a document that prescribes who they must appoint as an ST partner.
Mrs. Stratum, what I'm driving at, I mean, we know of the concern, but why in particular did you approach Mr. Bauer?
Yeah. I trusted his judgment and I trusted him as a colleague, and especially his role in terms of capital governance.
So did you raise the issue with him?
Yes, okay. I discussed the matter with him, yes.
And what, if anything, was his advice to you?
His advice to me was that I had to escalate it to my line manager at that stage.
And who was your line manager?
My line manager was Mrs. Cleopatra Shicheka. She was general manager for planning. She was also general counsel for TFR at that stage.
So as general counsel, would I be correct in my understanding that she was also a lawyer?
That's correct, yes.
And she was your line manager?
Yes.
Did you then raise the issue with her?
Yeah. Yes. Henk Bester, Alan Gray and myself met with Cleo in the Carlton Centre on the 7th of August.
Is that the same day?
Yes.
All right.
She indicated we need to meet immediately, and we met with her in the Carlton.
So you travelled from Woodmead to the Carlton Centre?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
And can you remember where in the Carlton Centre you held this meeting?
We met her in the Wimpy, downstairs.
Just remind us of who was present at this meeting.
So at the meeting, it was myself, Alan Gray, and Henk Bester, together with Cleo, just
Ms.
the four of
Shisheka.
us. Miss Shisheka, yes.
What transpired during the course of this meeting?
We shared we gave her a full briefing of what had happened to date, of what transpired to date. She was very concerned. She took a photograph of the addendum, which Hatch had with them, the addendum that they were now requested to sign. And then she assured them that she would take the matter further and investigate it.
All right. Did you later inform Mr. Bester of anything further to this meeting?
At a later point, and I cannot recall if it was feedback from Ms. Sicheka or from Johan Bauer, that indicated the matter was dealt with, I informed Mr. Bester that the matter was escalated to Mr. Singh, and it was now considered closed, and that no action would be taken on that basis.
You told him that the matter had been, as you put it, escalated to Mr. Singh, that it was considered closed and no further action would be taken.
That's correct, yes.
And you say that you told him that based on?
Either a discussion or feedback from Johan Bauer, or feedback from, or lack of feedback potentially from Ms. Sicheka.
You can't remember
I can't
which
remember
of
the
two?
detail which of the two it was. But it was clear that the matter was considered closed and should be left.
Yes, but just to make it clear, were you told that by one or other of these two people?
Yes.
It wasn't an inference that you drew?
No.
All right. Then at paragraph 42, I beg your pardon, you deal with the involvement of Mr. Gary Peter. Who was he?
Gary Peter at that stage was Group Chief Supply Chain Officer of Transnet. He personally, and it was strange, managed the negotiations for Rail Phase 1, which was unusual because Transnet Capital Projects had a procurement division and was equipped to handle negotiations of this sort. And especially, it's a very specialized type of negotiation, EPCM. It's not your normal business contracts that you sign. So it was strange that he would lead that himself, where TCP could have done that.
Did you ever receive any report from Mr. Bester about Mr. Peter?
I think following the negotiation, Mr. Bester indicated to me that during the negotiations, Mr. Peter was very, very aggressive with them and aggressive towards them right throughout. Yeah.
And then at paragraph 43, you deal with MMQS. Could you address that topic, please?
Yes, in terms of the SD companies in phase 1, I'm not sure who the final companies were, but Mr. Basson at some point mentioned to me that MMQS was one of the preferred companies. Yes. In passing, and I know that during the procurement process of phase 2, the subsequent phase, Mr. Basson indicated to me that Mr. Herbert Msagala was at that stage appointed as the new chief executive of TCP. Also told him to instruct the rail JV, H2NS, or H2N, to appoint MMQS as an SD partner.
So that was on phase 2?
That's correct. So I recall the name in both phases as being discussed.
So Mr. Masakhala had instructed him?
Yes.
Or told him to instruct the H2N JV, and we'll come to that in a moment, to appoint MMQS as one of the SD partners.
That is correct, yes.
Do you know, Ms. Stratum, whether it's pronounced as Msagala or Msagala? Do you know what the correct pronunciation is? Msagala or Msagala?
I assume it will be Msagala. I assume it will be Msagala.
Oh, okay, I thought you might know. Okay, all right.
I was not present in those discussions.
Did Mr. Basson tell you what he had told Mr. Msagala, if that's the correct pronunciation, in response?
Yes, he advised him that it was not appropriate. Transnet could not prescribe.
All right, and then to end off on phase 1, you say to complete the chronology of events, on 21 November 2013, Molefe approved the award of the confinement of phase 1 to Hatch, and you've attached the relevant memorandum as Annexure SD6.
That's correct, yes.
Perhaps I could just take you there for the sake of completeness. That you find at page 197. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
It's a memorandum to Mr.
Sorry,
Molefe.
that's 100 and?
So 190.
197.
196 is the blank page. It's 197, Mr.
Okay.
Chairperson. That's a memorandum to Brian Molefe from Charles Muller, dated the 12th of November. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And let's go to the recommendation at page 200. Paragraph 16, the GCE note the status of the confinement and award of the Engineering, Procurement and Construction Management, EPCM, services for Deal 4, Phase 1 of Manganese 16 MTPA TFR expansion project to Hatchgober.
That's correct, yes.
Signed, recommended by a series of people, including Mr. Bierman, Gary Peter, you've mentioned, Anand Singh, you've mentioned, and finally approved by Mr. Malefe.
That's correct.
If we then go back, please, to your affidavit, you now deal with phase 2. And phase 2 is dealt with under a number of cross-headings, the first of which is the period up to award of phase 2. That's January to November 2014. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Explain how phase 2 or what happened during that period of time.
Following the completion of the feasibility studies, if you can recall, phase 1 was now in execution. I led the development of the integrated business case for the remaining work. In the integrated business case, the phase 1 costs were included. There were concerns with calculations related to the escalations in the estimates supporting the business case, so escalations and contingencies, and a decision was taken to submit the phase 2 to a mega project or mega program scrubbing by the group GCIA headed by Mr. Mohamed Mohammadi. So it was the first of its kind.
So incidentally, what does this term scrubbing mean?
It means that every aspect of the business case and every aspect of the investment element of the business case, cost, expenditure, scope, etc., will be reviewed and subject to questioning and validation.
So thorough interrogation
Yes.
and review.
Very, very thorough.
And
yeah.
is this then what you deal with at paragraph 46?
That's correct, yes.
Who was
Yeah.
appointed to undertake that scrubbing exercise?
Mckinsey and regiments were appointed by GCIA to undertake the scrubbing, and it on the basis of the platinum standard that they recommended to Transnet. In terms of the actual work done, the scrubbing work was predominantly done by Mckinsey. There was limited involvement from the Transnet GCIA team at that stage.
And who headed up the Mckinsey team?
The McKinsey team was headed up by Mr. Prakash Parbu at that stage. He was heavily involved in the completion of the business case, so not only the scrubbing, but then also the subsequent completion of the business case, which was outside the scope of what the scrubbing should be. And we questioned that, the continuous and prolonged involvement following the scrubbing. And Mr. Singh explained it in the context of the platinum standard to us, that their involvement is to improve the quality of the business case as it goes through.
And what other impression did you form about McKinsey?
For us, McKinsey was in charge of this business case. The scrubbing process, the business case development process, and they were acting with the mandate of Mr. Singh, the Group Chief Financial Officer at that stage. They were fully in charge in every aspect of the business case. And maybe to elaborate on that and why this business case was important, in the business case, it was not only about the numbers. We also had to detail the execution strategy. How are we going to execute this project? We had to detail the sourcing strategies, your procurement strategies, as well as contract negotiation strategies. So all of this was detailed in the business case, and they were fully in charge of what went into the final business case.
Can you, at paragraph 48, explain that TCP approached the market for the execution of phase 2 rail and port EPCM? So was that then split, phase 2 between rail and port?
Yes, we split because of the size and nature of specialization, we split the phase 2 in a rail and port element. The EPCM was also split in a FL3B, which was a design completion element, and FL4, which was then the actual execution element. We approached the market with those offers, expecting that it's going to take a bit longer to get approval, and we received approval within 2 months. So it was as a mitigation that we structured the tenders in that way.
All right, and did this, with hindsight, raise any concerns in your mind?
Yes, if you look at the timing, the fact that we submitted the business case in March, it was approved in May, which was literally 2 months. It was unheard of to receive approval so quickly. And in hindsight, given the public information available, it was at the same time that the 1064 locomotives served and was approved and payments made. It was all in that period leading up to May 2014, between March and May 2014. So it begs to question if DPE had any role in accelerating the approval of this business case.
What was the contract, the estimated value of rail and port contracts?
The value rail contract was about R1 billion, as per the business case, and the port contract was around about 700 million.
Well, here you refer to 700 million to 1 billion.
To 1 billion, so the range was between 700 million and 1 billion.
Was that for each of them?
For each, yeah.
Were there ST targets applicable to
Yes.
phase 2 and the rail and port contract?
Yes, the SD targets for both were set at 45%, so of the total contract value, and an additional 30% of the value had to be subcontracted to small businesses. EMEs, your qualifying small enterprises, black-owned businesses, black women-owned businesses. So you had an SD target of 45%, of which 30% of that value had to be earmarked for specific businesses.
So it's 30% of the 45%?
Yes.
It wasn't 45 plus 30?
No, it's 30%
And this
of the 45.
45% target, if I understand correctly, was then down from the 50% in phase 1?
This was separate to phase 1.
Yes.
However, the SD targets initially were set as high as 50% for the project. And then, so linked to the SD targets, there were significant performance bonds. So there were twofold construction performance bond and as well as SD performance bond. And they were very onerous and the targets were high, and potential bidders complained to DPE that it was impossible to perform against some of these requirements. So the bonds were reduced and the SD was then settled at 45%.
And that you deal with in paragraphs 50 and 51?
Yes.
And then at paragraph 50?
I'm sorry. Did you say with regard to those two percentages, 30% is 30% of the 45%?
Yes.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
so it's not correct to say 30% of the contract value?
So where you say at
No,
50?
I will have to, I must check the information to make sure that the facts are correct.
Can you see in paragraph 50?
Yes, I see that.
It says 30% of the contract value. That's not correct.
45% of the contract value to be assigned toward SD, 30% It would be then over and above that.
It would be?
It would then be over and above the 45%, an additional 30%. I have the actual RFP
So there would
as
be-
an annexure.
There would be,
Yeah. 30%,
there would be an SD component,
yes,
okay? There's a value, total value relating to the SD component.
that's correct, yes.
And then the 45% is the 45% of the total SD component value
The 45% is the
of
total.
the entire contract.
So if the contract is R1 billion, 45% of that value, so 450 million, will be earmarked for SD. On top of that, 30% of the total value, so another 300 million, will then have to be subcontracted to small businesses.
So altogether, it would be 45 plus 30,
That's correct, yes.
which would bring it to how much? 75?
Almost
Is it 75?
Yeah, 75%.
75%? Are you sure?
Yes,
That sounds,
the information as I recorded it here is as per the tender documentation, which is annexed in this.
Mr.
And
Mike,
we
Let's
can go
perhaps
to the
that.
annexure.
But, Ms. Stratum, before we do that, just bear with me, please. At paragraph 50, due to the onerous SD, and you talk about 45% and an additional 30% of the contract value had to be subcontracted to small business, right?
Correct?
And then in the middle of the paragraph, you say, bidders were required to commit that in respect of the SD component, 45% of the contract value to be assigned towards SD. In addition, 30% of the contract value to be subcontracted to small businesses,
Yes,
i.e. exempted micro enterprises and qualifying small enterprises, startups and or large significant black-owned enterprises. Is that right?
that's correct.
Now, you then talk about, or you make reference to Annexure DS7, that you find at page 202. And could I take you, please, let me start off by asking you, this Annexure 202, what is this document?
Apologies, I just...
Annexure DS7 at page 202.
The document is the request for proposal, so the tender information that was provided to the bidders.
What is known as an RFP.
RFP, yes, request for proposal.
Could I take
Yeah.
you then to a portion of the RFP at page 206? There's a heading at the top, pre-qualifying supply development. Do you see that?
Yes,
Could you go to the the fourth paragraph under that
yes.
and read that, please?
45% of the contract value needs to be assigned towards SD and evident within the template provided in Annexure B. In addition, 30% of the contract value shall be subcontracted to small businesses. EME, QSEs and startups, preferably black-owned, black women-owned and people with disability.
And it's effectively that provision or that paragraph that is the source then of paragraph 50 of your affidavit.
Correct.
Could you please
So-
go back to your affidavit at page 151? You have already told the chairperson that there were various complaints, the bond requirements were reduced, notwithstanding the reduction, larger EPCMs had to form JVs and include smaller EPCM companies in their structures. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
I just want to make sure I understand this. Going back to paragraph 50, does that mean that the main contractor would end up with about 25%? My arithmetic might not be good. 25% of the work?
Mr. Chair, if I may, I understand now where the confusion come in, if I can explain it.
Yeah.
Supplier development initiatives, which is 45%, there are specific criteria or areas that we identify for supplier development. That is a separate matter to subcontracting to small businesses. So of that 45% earmarked for supplier development, it's skills transfer, technology transfer, etc. So of that 45%, so of the total value of the contract, 45% of that had to be focused on the supply development initiatives. The total contract value, 30% of the work in the total contract value also had to be subcontracted to small businesses. So it's not a percentage of a percentage. You have your SD targets that you want to achieve, and then there was a specific target to also subcontract 30% of the total contract value to small businesses. An SD partner could be a larger business as well.
Yes, I'm just trying to check. If I get a contract, as you said, for 1 billion rand, and I'm required to make sure that 45% goes to supplier development, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So that's 450,000.
Yeah.
Now, that means I'm left with about, what, 55? And then I must still take 30% and give to what's another sector, small business. Then what am I remaining with to do?
The way supply development is structured, and I am not an expert in this, for EPCM, so for the professional services, because it's professional services, Transnet identified specific areas, SD areas, because they wanted to develop a supply base. So for instance, technology transfer, you look at skills transfer. So the main contractors had to be able to indicate how they spend this money. So it's in the project still. So let's say they do design work to design a berth or a terminal.
I think I understand that. Yeah. I mean, I'm in business. I want to make money. I don't mind, sharing the work with others and let them have part of the cake. But on this, it just looks to me like I'm going to be left with 25% of the work. I'm just wondering, is that viable in terms of business?
It won't necessarily be 25% of the work. As I've indicated, the SD targets and the percentage that had to be contracted to small businesses have to be separated. But it is a fact that the JVs, where in the past they would have had the full scope of the project, they enjoyed much less in terms of the actual scope of work. So they had to bring in more partners and other businesses to assist them in completing the work.
Well, maybe at some stage, maybe another witness or some other document will explain it better.
Mr. Chairman, I was going to suggest perhaps, like you did with the previous witness, we could ask Ms. Stratum to provide a supplementary affidavit where she perhaps just explains this practically. It seems that the technical jargon we have, we know where it comes from.
Yes.
Perhaps to answer your question in particular, what does this actually leave the principal contractor?
At a practical level.
Right.
Yeah, if she can do a supplementary affidavit, that would be helpful.
Thank you. So, Ms. Stratum, let's go then to paragraph 52. You talk about the fact that in September, October 2014, TCP established an integrated tender evaluation team. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Do you explain that, please?
The integrated tender evaluation team had representation from TCP, from the operating divisions, from main disciplines such as commercial procurement, etc. So it was a representative Transnet team that was established.
Now, if we go over the page, you've spoken about contractors forming JVs, and here you deal with 2 of them. Which are they? Did Hatch form a JV?
Yes, sorry, that should be on the next page, apologies. Yes, so in terms of the size of the scope as well as the ST requirements, bonds, etc., most companies formed JVs. Hatch, Mott MacDonald, and Oricon formed a JV for the rail scope.
There were 4 parties that formed that JV. Just have a look, please, at paragraph 53. It was Hatch.
Oricon, Mott MacDonald, and Siatuta JV.
And in this affidavit, you refer to that as H2N.
H2N, yes.
And then was another JV formed?
Yes, the other JV, main JV, was FLAG, Fluor, ACOM, and GIB.
And that's known by the acronym FLAG.
FLAG, yes.
And you go on to say that they were identified as the preferred bidders for both Rail Phase 2 and Port Phase 2.
That's correct. Both parties were informed that they were preferred bidders for rail and port, and that the negotiations would consider both. The submissions then for both.
So let's then deal with those negotiations, and you deal with them at paragraph 54.
The negotiation process was led by Ms. Corley Janse van Rensburg from TCP. She was in the procurement department, supported by the TCP project director for manganese at that stage, Valeli Sikusana, and Mr. Edward Thomas, who was in the group supply chain office at that stage. Mckinsey was heavily involved. The venue was set up in such a way that Mckinsey had a back office right throughout the negotiation period, where they could follow the proceedings. The intention with having them there, given that they were heavily involved in developing the negotiation and contracting strategies initially, was to then debrief with a steering committee after the proceedings or closing the proceedings every day, and then agree on a new negotiation strategy for the following day.
And who did that negotiation steering committee comprise of?
Anna Singh, Gary Pita, Herbert Msagala, and Mohamed Mahmoudi.
Can you remember when these negotiations commenced?
It commenced during late October, November. So it was towards the end of November, end of 2014.
During the course of those negotiations, can you recall having been contacted by Mr. Bester?
Yes, I can recall.
And was that a telephonic discussion, or did you meet with him in person?
Yeah. A telephonic discussion.
What did he convey to you during the course of this telephonic discussion?
He indicated to me that he was asked by Mr. Reddy, the same Mr. Reddy, to attend a meeting with Mr. Salim Essa on Mr. Reddy's insistence at a local restaurant.
Sorry, please can you speak up?
Yeah. He was requested by, apologies, he was requested by Mr. Dave Reddy to attend a meeting with Mr. Salim Essa at a local restaurant, which would have been Sandton area, thereabouts.
So he told you that he attends this meeting?
Yes.
All right, with Reddy and Mr. Essa?
Mr. Essa, yes.
Did he explain to you what happened during the course of this meeting? Did he report to you?
Yes, he indicated to me that Mr. Essa spoke about his relationship with Mr. Singh, that they had a lot of power, a lot of influence, that they had access to any and all tenders. Yeah, so he was very open about his relationship with Anosh and you know, the power that they wielded.
Yes? And did he
He
report
also-
anything else to you?
Yes, he also indicated to me that Mr. Essa then insisted on H2N, the JV, including his company, so as a designated SD partner in the Phase 2 project, the Phase 2 rail project. So he also, it's my interpretation of what was said, he then proposed to H2N that they can pay what is tantamount to a bribe of about 80 million rand. And for that 80 million, he can secure the contract for them. He has the ability to ensure that they will then get the contract.
I just want to take you to paragraph 55 because there seemed to have been some corruption with track changes. 3 lines from the bottom. According to Mr. Bester, at the meeting, Essa spoke of him and Singh having a lot of power that you've dealt with, mentioned that they had access to all tenders, insisted on H2N including designated Phase 2 tender submission. There seems to be some words missing there. Would you confirm that?
Yes.
How ought it to read?
It should read, insisted on H2N including his company.
That being Essa's company.
That's being Essa's company.
Yes.
As a designated SD partner in the Phase 2 submission.
So do you recall Mr. Bester saying that to you?
Yes.
And then you go on to say, and propose that H2N pay a bribe of 18 million to secure the contract.
Yes. I can recall the value specifically, yes.
And did Mr. Bester go into any detail about that?
No, he didn't indicate how that could be paid.
Could I ask you then, please, to deal with paragraph 56?
On the matter of a bribe, it is possible to create a surplus on a project of this nature and, you know, with the quantums of money that we're working with, either by increasing the contract value during negotiations or post-negotiations, after award. So you have to have access to the contract value in order to manipulate those values. And that would have to be done internally in Transnet. That difference can then be paid out to an SD partner. I then, in terms of this project and in terms of the delegated authority for the management of contract values, that resided with Gary Pita and Anosh Singh.
So you say in this paragraph, on the issue of a bribe, as experience has shown, it is possible to create a surplus of 80 million. You're addressing that because you say he told you of a bribe of 80 million on a project of this nature, either by increasing the contract value during negotiations or afterwards, or by increasing the delegated contract value internally.
That's correct, yes.
Those are terms of art, presumably.
Yeah.
The increase could then be paid out to the SD partner. And as you've mentioned, you say significantly Peter and Singh were in control of the approval of the contract value.
That's correct, yes.
And you go on to say, I annex here too marked DS8 depicting the increase in value of the port scope. Now, H2N, we know, were ultimately awarded the rail part.
That's right, yes.
So this annexure deals not with rail but with port.
It deals with port, an increase in...
It reflects the increase in value. And then you say there was no increase in respect of the rail scope. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So let's go then, please, to the table at DS8, which is at page 217. what you are trying to show to the chairperson is that on the basis of an analysis of this table and figures, it would have been possible, on your view, to increase the rail component by 80 million rand.
Yes, that's correct.
Please explain then the table.
Okay. So in terms of the approved budget initial, that is the value as per the cost estimate in the business case for the respective packages. Contract approval before negotiation, that is based on the value of the bid received from that bidder. So the table is an example of the actual numbers received. So 810 would be the rail value received from the rail JV, and 519 value received from the port JV at that stage. DCV before negotiations is your delegated consent or contract value before negotiations. That is normally a percentage of your original budget estimate, which is a value within which the negotiating team can negotiate. It gives them those parameters. You have a risk allowance, so based on your original estimate, plus your delegated value before negotiations, you have some money left, which is then a surplus of the risk allowance. You then negotiate. So following the negotiations, the DCV after negotiations is then the final value as negotiated with the specific party, and the value within which the project team can then manage that specific package. In this case, so the total saving on the port project, because that surplus of the risk allowance is funds that have to be available in the project, was zero. And on the rail side, there was a significant saving made. So effectively, all I'm trying to illustrate here is with these processes, you are able to manipulate. I'm not saying this is what was done. You can change values for some or other means.
If we just go back to paragraph 57, because lawyers and I, amongst them, are better with words than with figures. But you explain it in words at 56. You say you can create a surplus of 80 on the project of this nature, either by increasing the contract value during negotiations or afterwards, or by increasing the delegated contract value. Is that right?
That's
so
correct.
Presumably delegated contract value is DCV.
Yes.
And where do we find the contract value figure?
So the contract value will be the final value.
All right.
And the way that you can play with the risk allowances in both.
When you say the final value, which value is that?
That will be the value at the bottom of the table. So that was the final value agreed to after negotiations.
Those are the figures that are highlighted in red.
Correct.
Okay.
And it clearly indicates that for rail, the DCV went down, and for port, the DCV went up after negotiations.
So the point is, though, that on those figures in rail, there was enough fat, for want of a better description, to have paid out in some or other way 80 million rand, and still one could balance the books, so to speak.
Correct, yes.
Because ultimately there was a surplus of 177.
Yes.
All right. At paragraph 57 of your affidavit, at page 153, you say there are other aspects of your interaction with Mr. Bester that warrant mention. What are they?
He also mentioned to me that following the first meeting with Mr. Essa, there was a subsequent meeting with Mr. Essa where Anash Singh was present as well. I don't know the details of what was discussed during that session. He also informed me at some point that the TCP project director, Mr. Vile Sikusana, was fairly aggressive with him and used fairly foul language with him at some point during the negotiation process. So,
When you say that
Because-
Mr.
yeah.
Bester told you about a subsequent meeting, are you sure it was a subsequent one with Essa and Singh, if you have regard to the text of paragraph 57?
it was a meeting. It could have been prior to the first one. I can recall that there was a meeting where Mr. Singh was, and then
But
a
you
separate
don't know
meeting.
which side of the
No.
meeting with Essa that he reported to you that was?
Correct, yes. I don't know the details of when these meetings took
Then
place.
you draw a conclusion in paragraph 58. What is that?
Based on what was happening in the project, it was very, very clear to me that there was a large network involved, inside and outside Transnet. And I mentioned Mckinsey specifically as well to secure tenders to the benefit of a few. It was,
Please talk to the chair.
apologies. Yeah. It was my view, given the discussions that was had with the H2N JV, the experiences with Mckinsey in the project, that there was a network involved in properly securing tenders.
All right. Anything else you want to mention under that heading?
No, I think we've covered most of that.
Yes. Then let's deal with the next period beyond the award, December 2014 to cancellation.
Yes.
Now you deal in paragraph 60 with the fact that H2N was identified as the successful bidder for the rail scope and FLAG as the successful bidder for the port scope.
That's correct. Yeah.
And then you go on to deal with the award to FLAG. Could you address that, please?
What was quite concerning about the award to FLAG was that the award was at an amount that was more than 200 million higher than the H2N bid for the same work. If you can recall, both parties we indicated to both parties that we will negotiate for rail and port with both. This was in conflict. So to award to another company when you have an offer on the table that's 200 million lower was totally against the platinum standards, where ideally you would want to do the opposite. You would want to reduce cost as best you can and use every opportunity in your project to keep costs as low as possible. So it was very, very strange.
Were you opposed to that?
Yes,
Did you voice that opposition at any time?
yes. We were invited to a meeting, Corley van Rensburg and I, to discuss this matter prior to submitting the final recommendations for the EPCM scopes. The meeting was attended by Gary Pita, Mohamed Mohammadi, and Prakash Parbu from Mckinsey, where they put a case forward based on business risk to award the phase 2 scope to FLAG, the port scope to FLAG at a higher price. So there was a business risk mitigation discussion and reasons given why the project had to be awarded at 200 million in excess of H2N's offer to FLAG.
And what stance did you adopt?
We were against this because it wasn't consistent with the procurement processes, which after you've done your ST and technical qualification, then price becomes the next qualifier.
And when you say we, you're referring to you and who else?
Corley van Rensburg.
During this period, the period beyond the award, did Mckinsey remain involved?
Yes.
Could you deal with that, please?
Yes. So despite the contract negotiation with the EPCM companies, they remained involved in amendments to the contract documentation. And it was a continuous process. It was as if Noshing continuously tried to seek opportunities for Mckinsey to improve and amend the contracts. Obviously, this was very difficult for the EPCMs. The last change that Mckinsey introduced to the contracts resulted in the EPCMs never signing the contract. Both EPCMs never signed the contract. And this exposed Transnet to future litigation. So the fact that they continuously made changes unilaterally at the end of the concluding negotiations, unilaterally made changes, resulted in contracts that were unsigned effectively.
You then go on to deal with the cancellation of the contract. When did that happen and how did it come about?
We cancelled the contract in March 2017. The prevailing market conditions, both for Transnet from a financial perspective as well as for the manganese industry at that stage, led to us questioning or industry questioning the affordability of this expansion. And we then put forward a recommendation to the Transnet Exco, or Capital Investment Committee, that the contract be terminated, put on hold, and with a view that we need to terminate. So it was for reasons stated in the contract made provision for situations such as these from a business environment perspective. Yeah. So that was effectively 2.5 years after, not even 2 years after the work started on the contract.
You say at paragraph 67 that you personally managed the cancellation of the contract.
That's correct. I took over, if you can recall, I was with group planning, a program director there, and TCP was executing the project. At that stage, I took over the manganese expansion program in full. TCP was restructured to form a new unit called Transnet Group Capital. And Mr. Chris Reddy, who was heading it up, then appointed me to take care of the manganese expansion, and Mr. Sikusana was moved to other projects. So I personally led the cancellation of the contract together with Ms. Andra de Tooy, who was from the legal team.
Then finally you deal with the reporting of irregularities. Did you at a point in time report your suspicions and concerns?
Yes.
When was that?
Towards the end of 2014, so specifically on phase 2, I reported what transpired on phase 1 and phase 2 to Mr. Bramley May. He was head of forensics at Transnet Freight Rail at that stage. I met with him at TFR's lawyers' offices, lawyers that they use in Oxford Road. And following, it was a more than 5-hour conversation. Following that meeting, I had no feedback from him until such time as in 2018, the forensics department in TGC approached him to request copies of the recording of the meeting from him. He indicated to them that he destroyed it as he felt the matter wasn't relevant to TFR. Apologies, to TFR at that stage. So I reported it because it is the right thing to do.
You had also previously, just to remind us, you had reported it to your line manager.
Correct, yes.
When you're dealing with phase 1.
Yes.
And then you say that you raised that with Mr. Reddy.
That's correct. So I reported to Mr. Reddy in group planning. He was appointed as the new head of Transnet Group Capital. This matter was raised with Mr. Reddy, and he immediately referred it to the SIU for investigation.
And are you aware of what the status of that investigation is?
Not at all.
Mr. Chairman, subject to the witness providing the Commission with the affidavit that we spoke about, and I suppose for the sake of completeness, perhaps, Stratum, in that affidavit, you could also just make the correction to paragraph 55 that you've dealt with. Apart from that, those are our questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Stratum, for coming to give evidence. You are excused. You have a homework to do.
Yes,
You will let us have the supplementary affidavit within the time that Mr. Mybeck will tell you about. Thank you very much.
Thank
You are
you.
excused. That's all for today, Mr. Mybeck.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And then tomorrow it's Mr.
Mr.
Lahe.
Lahe.
Yes. Okay, all right. Okay. We are going to adjourn, and tomorrow we'll start at 10. We adjourn.